Good afternoon, and welcome to the EAS webinar on developing VMS products for commercial and compliance success, hosted by EAS Consulting Group and presented by EAS Independent Consultant, Dr. Steve Cammarn. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters with the prime focus of assisting domestic and foreign dietary supplement, pharmaceutical, medical device, cosmetic, food, and tobacco firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA compliance and inspection officials and industry executives and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Today's presenter is Dr. Steve Cammarn. Dr. Cammarn is an expert in pharmaceuticals and personal care products with particular focus on quality assurance and manufacturing, research, and development. Prior to consulting, Dr. Cammarn built a career at the Procter & Gamble Company, where he oversaw quality assurance and quality control in plants across 6 continents, and had direct oversight in areas such as formulation, process engineering, and technical services. Dr. Cammarn's doctorate is in pharmaceutical science from the University of Cincinnati. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions by typing them into the questions box. And after the webinar, you'll receive a short survey where you're invited to provide feedback and offer additional topics of interest for future EAS webinars. With that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to Steve.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Steve Cammarn. I'm delighted to be here today. Good morning, to those on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those in the Midwest and the East. And I'm delighted to talk this topic today about how you work compliance and commercial success together. Now, in my industry experience, I had originally thought, like many do, that compliance is a cost to the business. Though after many years, I learned that the compliant development work done right is actually a positive investment that can lead to commercial success. Compliance and commercial success is possible if you plan and schedule it, you resource it with thorough development work enabled by the right technical mastery and the right development skills, and enabled by the right regulatory knowledge and understanding and mastery. If you put all these together in a structured, phased approach to development, you can achieve both compliance and commercial success. So I talk about phases, and the phases I'll talk about today are the design phase for the product, the package, and the supply chain, the qualification phase where you're demonstrating the ability to deliver that product, process, and supply chain. We'll briefly touch on launch, and also there's always continual improvement that is required to be done after you launch the product. Now, a brief comment on the scope of this presentation. The content associated with product development and compliance is truly vast and cannot be thoroughly covered in this 1 hour, 45-minute time that we have today. So today's talk will be largely an overview of this work, but I will choose to delve into some specific areas more deeply. I will not be getting into the underlying QA/QC systems because my assumption is that you should have those and that they exist in your companies. Nevertheless, if you do want to dig deeper into any of the topics that I covered today, or discuss the underlying QA systems and capabilities, just recognize EAS has a variety of outstanding experts, as well as extensive training that can help you with these topics, and you do have the contact information. So let's start with the design phase. When you're going on a trip, it's usually best for everyone in the car to decide where you're going to go, and the same is true with product development. The first step will be to negotiate with your functions, with your business management, and align on what those musts are versus the wants in your design criteria. You need to distinguish between those musts because you have to deliver them, and separate those from the nices that would just be nice to achieve. The scope of this design criteria includes such things as what you're going to deliver. That's the benefit that you're providing to your customer and the claim that you will be making, and often dictates what the dietary ingredient needs to be. You also need to define the when the where and who of your market. That's the geography, and the consumer that you're trying to reach. And both of those, in combination with the claims, often dictate the regulatory requirements that you need to meet. You certainly will have some boundary conditions on finances that are given by your organization. And then you need to explore how you're going to do this. What is your supply chain? What is the necessary shelf life? And what channels you'll be going through. So you'll need to decide and negotiate which of these many criteria are absolutes and which are nice to haves. And make sure you document that because it will become important later. And don't confuse the two as you go forward. As mentioned, the design phase will often trigger some in-depth investigation into the regulatory requirements. So you'll need to do some research here on the underlying regulatory requirements very early in your design phase. Most importantly, are you dealing with a new dietary ingredient? And the FDA considers anything that is marketed after, marketed before 10/15/94 as not a new dietary ingredient, provided that it's a similar intake level and similar process. But if you're going to be involved with a new dietary ingredient, just recognize it will take much longer and take much more investment going forward. Certainly, you need to find what that dietary ingredient or dietary ingredients are that will deliver that benefit. A reminder, FDA considers dietary ingredients as vitamins, minerals, herbs, or amino acids. Many of these may have specific regulations associated with them. Some of them may have monographs that you may want to lean on in your development. And some of them also have overage limitations driven by safety considerations. So do your research on the regulations associated with dietary ingredients. How you choose to deliver this will also dictate your stability requirements. Recall there's two different types, type 1 and type 2, those that you're fortifying and those that are naturally occurring. So if you're providing fish oil and the omega-3s from the fish oil itself, you'll have different stability requirements than if you fortify a product with additional fatty acids. So understand those regs, that's in 1019G. And then finally, you need to define what your roles are and will be in the supply chain. You'll need to define what are you going to do? Are you going to be the dietary ingredient manufacturer or the dietary supplement? Are you going to be a repackager? Are you going to rely on others? All of those have different regulatory requirements that define what needs to be done. So understand the scope of what you're intending to achieve. So with the selection of your dietary ingredient, you probably should invest in some research, either literature or laboratory, on the liabilities of those ingredients. For vitamins, the most common liability here is stability, and that's pretty well known. And it's also compatibility with other ingredients. Now, much of this information is available in the literature, but you may choose to do your own pre-formulation studies. Again, we can get into that separately, but research studies to look at the compatibility of those ingredients with your other ingredients in your formulations. With herbals, the challenge is typically investing in the robust identification of the herb and ensuring the integrity of the supply chain for that herb. Furthermore, if you choose to claim potency of a chemical constituent in that herb, you will need to invest in method development, understand the variability of that constituent in your supply chain, and ensure the stability of that constituent. Now, minerals are generally stable, but can act as peroxidants for other things. Metals, for example, can act as peroxidants. Both vitamins and minerals, however, can exist in fairly minute quantities. And as we'll get into, adding and maintaining uniformity of minute quantities in dry blends is quite a challenge. So there can be some process challenges. And with probiotics, obviously the challenge here is stability, which is often driven by mostly water activity and temperature. Now, this slide dictates something I grabbed from the literature on what actually causes vitamin instability and which vitamins are most affected by what parameter. And you can see that vitamins are susceptible to a lot of different mechanisms that cause their degradation. And this is the type of information that you need to research as you enter into your formulation development work. Also early in the development phase, you'll need to understand what type of form you're going to be supplying to your consumer and to the trade. I've listed many of the various forms of oral products, but recognize each one has its own advantage and disadvantage. For example, tablets are quite inexpensive and very stable because they're dry. However, because you rely on the process to ensure that you form a good tablet, they tend to be very process sensitive. Hard shell capsules have some of the benefits of stability and a little easier to process than tablets. However, they tend to be a little bit more expensive. Soft gels and gummies, consumer preferred these days. However, they are more expensive. Soft gels often have limitations on what the fill formulation needs to be, and gummies or things that have high water content will have stability considerations. Powders and liquids, you've got some consumer questions on whether that's what the form that they want. Powders tend to be stable and low cost. Liquids, remember your shipping water can be high cost. Also, liquids can also have some stability risks. What it really comes down to here is you're going to have to choose which problem you think you can manage and which one that you cannot manage, and therefore you're going to select a form that doesn't give you that problem. With a few possible dosage forms and formulations selected, it's probably wise to get something up and cooking on stability. This allows you to generate some data that allows you to make informed decisions later on as you do your qualification work. It allows you to intercept that qualification with information on what is the most successful form. For pilot stability, you don't need to have a locked formula or formulation. In fact, I recommend you consider different ones. The methods need not be fully locked, but should be fit for use, which means that they need to be sufficient to make sure you're not misled by your own conclusions. One consideration that you'll probably need to think about is ensure that it's stability indicating, which means that the method can distinguish between the parent vitamin, mineral, or dietary ingredient and any degradants. Your process need not be locked or scaled up, but some considerations you may want to have as you go through this. Consider both ambient as well as accelerated stability. We typically think of accelerated as 40-75, but you actually can go higher, just recognizing that it is not necessarily indicative of a long-term, how many months you're going to get in stability, but it can allow you to make some relative choices. Certainly put up multiple formulations, because you're going to need backups, and multiple packages. As mentioned, vitamins can be a stability challenge, and there's a couple tips here on how you stabilize some of those vitamins. First and foremost, select the right vitamin. Vitamins exist in different forms, chemical constituents, and different counterions. For example, tocopherol and tocopherol acetate. Tocopherol vitamin E is often used as something that is a scavenger for oxidants. Tocopherol acetate is much more stable and is used to fortify vitamin E. Reducing agents, as mentioned, can act as accelerants in degradation. So things that you can do is you can consider bilayer tablets, where you literally have two different blends, and you'll compress one side of the formulation on one side with the metals and ions, and maybe the labile vitamins on the other side of the vitamin. You can also consider purchasing enrobed dietary ingredients, where the supplier will basically coat those dietary ingredients for you that will protect them from some of the other ingredients. Recognizing, however, that when you get into compression, you can actually damage some of that enrobing, and you can cause some instability. Finally, there's process considerations. As we will talk later, you can granulate some of your blends as a way to get more uniformity and to handle it better. However, water in the presence of these vitamins can cause instability. So you may want to look at other types of processes, such as dry granulations or even wax granulations. Hydrolysis of vitamins, as mentioned, is a major concern. You want to have good control of your dosage form moisture as you formulate it. So what is the moisture of your capsule or tablet or gummy or whatever? And the key factor here is actually water activity. That's the relative humidity above the headspace of that product. That is what has been correlated most heavily with vitamin stability and mold growth as well. So you want to control that moisture content or the water activity of the form. You also have to be concerned about moisture changes on stability. The way to do that is through packaging. You'll have to select, and we'll get into different packaging barriers that you want to have. And remember that you may choose a good package barrier, but you probably will also need to consider some type of seal on the mouth of the bottle, because most of your water vapor transmission on instability actually goes through the threads of your package if it's a bottle. You can certainly consider desiccants, which can be dropped into your, often the bottle, but pouches and other containers. But remember, it really is of no use unless you have a good barrier and well-sealed package. Otherwise, you simply will transport moisture through the package wall into your desiccant and it will quickly be depleted. And finally, we've mentioned process considerations of ways to reduce moisture in your process through different types of granulation or handling techniques. Oxidation is also a key factor, particularly for vitamin D. You can consider nitrogen blanketing of your container, but recall it won't be of any use unless you have a good packaging barrier, and different packaging materials have different transport characteristics for nitrogen versus oxygen. You can, this is an area that you would consider the seal, for example. You can also consider oxygen scavengers, but remember, they're of no use without a good barrier to an oxygen transport through the container or through the threads of the package. As I've mentioned, packaging selection for unit doses or oral forms is, there's many different forms available, but it's critical for stability. And each one, like formulations, has their pros and cons, and you'll have to choose what's most important to you. Bottles, glass bottles in particular, are the Cadillac of stability, relatively impermeable to everything. However, there are costs associated with that. They're heavy, so it's going to increase your shipping costs. And secondly, you typically pay fees to your retailers due to breakage. And some retailers will actually put an overhead charge, regardless of whether you have breakage or not, due to the use of glass. You can consider plastic bottles as well. They're less expensive, they're lighter, easier to ship, but you need to consider permeability. Plastic tends not to be nearly as impermeable as glass. There's also environmental considerations. Blisters are, they enhance compliance, and this is not regulatory compliance. This is what's called patient compliance, whether your customer actually takes the dosage form as frequently. It's been shown that blisters increase the consumption of oral drugs. They tend to be inexpensive as well. However, many are permeable to moisture and oxygen. If you're going to be having things such as high iron content, you've got to consider child resistance, difficult to do in blisters, and then environmental considerations with any plastic. You can upgrade those to foil. Those would be relatively impermeable. They're more costly and they require special equipment, and they have the same downsides of child resistance and environmental concerns. So at this point, you've got your design criteria established. You've got a few formulations defined. You've got your package options defined. You understand the regulations, and you've got some things up and cooking on stability. You should also be exploring at this point some of your supply chain options and some of your claims and packaging options. This allows you to move into the qualification phase, which is you're going to be demonstrating your ability to deliver this repeatedly and commercially. One of the first considerations is establishing your process for making the product. I can't get into too much details here because the form and the formulation will dictate very different process development considerations. But in general, what you're seeking to do is establish your critical controls for your cost, for your quality, and your compliance. As mentioned, you will be establishing the control points. This is the points that are required to be established to confirm that you are establishing the right quality and controlling that quality. A key factor here is the order of additions and times of the unit operations. Those need to be defined. A particular concern with dry blends. You will have losses inevitably during your process, either physical losses upon transport or chemical losses. Those need to be understood and defined, which leads to your overage inclusions. Overage can be used, however, you need to document and justify what it is and ensure it's within your safety limits. All of this really results in the final compliant requirement of a master batch record. This is the locked process for making your product. This is a regulatory requirement and given in 111, Chapter 205. It's also in the preamble. Some of the things that you need to do in your batch record needs to, as mentioned, it needs to establish the control points. Now, at critical steps in each process, you may also need to have duplicate approvals for manual operations. So you need to include that as well, that you'll need 2 operators verifying some of these steps that you make the product. Your master batch record must also be written. So it needs to be written, documented, and QA approved in a change control document. Each master batch record needs to be formulation specific and batch size specific. So if you have a slightly different flavor, slightly different batch size, recognize you'll be challenged to have written, approved master batch records for each of those. And those master batch records need to define the strength, the name and the quantity of each ingredient, the theoretical yields, the intentional overages, and the description of the package and the label. Now, these aren't all the requirements. Again, they're given in 111.205. I encourage you to look at that. This is another area that I know EAS has done some training and consulting on of what needs to be done in master batch records. Now, I mentioned dry blends, although they yield some of the lowest cost and most stable products, tend to be some of the more technically challenging processes to consider. Foremost is segregation. So as powder flows, it will separate by density and by size of each particle. This is most highest risk in dilute blends and occurs typically on transfers. You can see this picture I've shown to the right shows a blend, a cross-section of a blend, and the different colors show different materials. Clearly, you're having non-uniformity in this blend. That means you're going to have a hard time of meeting your claims. A specific watch out on segregation of blends is it's very scale dependent. So you can do some work at the lab scale and say, hey, it's uniform. But as you get to your larger scale processes, where you have more mass being transferred, more air that is fluidizing the blend, you will tend to see much more segregation. So this is an area to get into early and understand your risks going forward. You can manage some of this with control of your particle size and density of your blend. I mentioned granulation, where you physically glue particles together using different techniques, and that allows you to control the uniformity and the size of the particles. That has some challenges in process, as well as could be some stability concerns. You also have a factor in blender design. Different blenders promote different levels of uniformity. And then scale-up studies, as I've mentioned, this is an area with dry blends you should invest later on in doing work at full scale, because you will tend to see these at higher scales. Another factor you need to think about with dry blends is compressibility. If you're looking at tablets, for example, not only are you requiring it to be uniform, but you also require it to be compressed into a solid dosage form. And that isn't always a given based on the characteristics of your blend. There are a variety of ingredients that you can add to your blend to aid flow and aid compressibility, and that can happen in the early formulation process development steps. So as you're doing your process work and you've got your formulation work, this is a great time to start down the road of establishing your specifications. As a reminder, Specifications for dietary supplements need to include identity, purity, strength, and composition, and also contaminants that may adulterate the materials. You need specifications at many steps in the process. You need it for the raw materials, in process, your finished product, your packaging and labeling components need to have specifications, and your finished packaged product needs to have a specification. All of these are given in the regs. I've listed the references here, and recognize that all of these specifications need to be approved by QA and in a controlled document, controlled and numbered document. Digging a bit deeper, probably most critical here that I found is identity, because identity always has to be performed on a product. As we'll get into, you can do some qualification work where you're relying on certificates of analysis, but you always must do an identity test on your dietary supplement or dietary ingredient as it transfers from one owner to another. This is either a single test or a combination of tests that are intended to show that you can uniquely identify the product and it is what is purported to be. Therefore, it needs to be discriminatory. You need to document the rationale for why these collection of tests are unique to your product. This is one the FDA typically asks for upon their audits, is show me the rationale, show me your identity test. Strength and composition, these are driven by your claims. Remember, you've got type 1 and type 2 stability requirements here. Understand the differences of what's required for type 1, which is fortified. You need to exceed 100% of your label over shelf life, not just on release, but you need to be able to show it over shelf life. And so therefore you will need the supporting data to show that you have met that. Purity and contaminants are really up to you, but I would strongly recommend that you consider heavy metals, glutens, and pesticides, depending on where your materials come from. For example, materials that are mined, such as talc, clays, et cetera, that may be in your formulation are very susceptible to heavy metals. You will certainly need to have some micro requirements. I would recommend that you defer to what's in USP 2023, because that defines generally accepted micro requirements for dietary supplements. Having said that, you need to analyze your product, understand its risks, and you may have additional requirements above and beyond what's in USP. As you do your specifications, this is a format that I've adopted, and what you show here is the test name, what the specific requirement is, and what I've often added is when I've drafted specs is who performs them. This eliminates the confusion of who's accountable. We'll get into some of that as we talk quality agreements going forward, and also the method. You can see here under the strength heading for folic acid, you can put a footnote in that says if the supplier is qualified and that you do it under a certificate analysis, it can be done by the C of A, but needs to be reconfirmed under a qualification test on a periodic basis. We'll talk that in a bit. A way to establish who does what for your testing and your controls is to do something I call a control point map. This is a flowchart of your material and your materials as you assemble them into a finished product. The red dashed lines show as you're transporting materials from one authority or owner to another, and the red circles are nodes where certain tests need to be done. It's a great opportunity to establish and work with your customers around, or your suppliers, around who's doing what testing at what point. This then dictates what specifications occur where. Now, as mentioned, it is permissible in dietary supplements to release materials based on certificate of analysis, but there's a big if here, and there's a number of things that need to be done to continue to do this. Remember, an identity test must always be performed. You cannot accept materials solely on certificate of analysis. I would recommend, it's not stipulated, but you'll be challenged to do purity tests upon transition from one entity to another. You need to have that supplier qualified, and that documentation They need to be documented that they're qualified under what criteria and protocol. And you need to be periodically requalifying them on a statistically established frequency. That's a testing schedule, is what we would call it. I recommend that this be documented in an SOP, and most importantly here, you need to align with you and your suppliers what you're going to do when that requalification fails, because it inevitably will happen. It's just the odds that at some point you will get different results. You need to be aligned on what you will be doing when that requalification inevitably fails for one parameter. Typically, it's going back and restarting the qualification, doing a investigation CAPA, and then restarting that qualification again. So based on my diploma from the School of Hard Knocks and experience, some of my learnings about specifications that I wanted to share with you. First of all, some people get eager on setting specifications, and you really need to challenge yourself to limit your specifications to what you must achieve. Nice to have parameters don't belong in specs, because you need to use the litmus test here of, I am willing to issue a recall if this fails, or at least consider it. So if you don't recall the product, you need to justify why. So only put in parameters in here that you are required to do or you're prepared to execute a recall if it fails. Recall that specifications need to be in place at the time of commercialization. So they need to be approved, documented, in place at the time you first start making your materials. You will need to document the rationales for your specifications. You will definitely need this at audit time, and particularly, you'll need to have that documentation of the identity test. I recommend putting a requalification testing program in an SOP, not in the specification, because if you put it in the specification, what happens is you receive a lot and you say, oh, I think I need to do a requalification program, but you're under pressure to release it. That leads to my last learning here. Never release a product to trade that is awaiting retesting in a testing schedule, because then you have the problem of what happens if it fails and I've already shipped a product out to the trade. I recommend that you set aside the lot, plan it in an SOP, in a procedure, and then once it's passed through its entire retesting schedule, you can then release that lot to the trade. So in parallel with setting your specifications, you should be establishing, and you don't have to validate, but you need to establish scientifically valid methods for all of your specifications. What does valid mean? It's not validated like it is in pharmaceuticals, but it is based upon scientific data or published results. A valid method in dietary supplements is generally interpreted as one that is accurate, precise, specific for use, and it's consistent and therefore robust to different uses. Again, we have EAS has a lot of good people that are much more knowledgeable in method development, and this is an area we can dig into separately if you need that. As you establish your methods, you should certainly, where you can, rely on published methods from example USP, AOAC, EPA, micromethods, EPA, etc. So where you can, rely on the published methods and then qualify it for use. If you have to go into de novo verification, recall that what you will have to do is have a protocol in place. QA has to approve that protocol, the success criteria, they will have to prove the results as well, and then that will all need to be documented. All of these methods will then need to be documented as final methods in an SOP going forward. As you do this, you should also be establishing your supply chain. So how do you start that? You want to narrow your candidates down to a few, 1 to 3 candidates. And what you're first going to do is you're going to typically approach them with a questionnaire. This is pretty common. So what your questionnaire may include is questions about their external audit history and regulatory history. You need to learn as you talk with them whether they're going to be transparent or flexible. I don't know how you do this in a questionnaire, but perhaps there's ways to do that. But as you talk with them, you want to judge whether they're going to be open to you. You need to understand their QA capability and technical mastery, who's in their organization, how many years, what lab capabilities, what process capabilities they have. What are their complaints from their customers? Not only from their consumers, but their customers going forward. And of course, cost. Against any of these, you'll need to assess your own risk versus your needs and your complexity. So if you're getting just a simple ingredient that's very common, you may not have a high degree of risk. If you're putting together a highly complex product that's going into multiple geographies, you have a much higher degree of risk and complexity. So there's not one answer here that fits all, but you need to assess that. Once you've got it down to the few, you want to conduct the audit, and you can either do that yourself or you can hire third-party auditors that will go in and do the audit for you of that supplier. Again, it's expected with your possible suppliers. You'll want to do some development work with them and verify the supplier can achieve this certificate of analysis, and you want to do this with third-party testing. So you want to send it to an independent lab. That's could be true for a material or a finished product. Typically, that's 3 lots of either the material, dietary ingredient, or the dietary supplement. Recall that you need to run a program to do that verification at least annually thereafter. It needs to be based on a statistically relevant sample size, but you need to assess your own risk and document what that verification program is. That's listed in 11175, and as mentioned, at some point in your product life cycle, you will have a failure of that retesting program, and you need to clarify what those actions need to be. As you're doing this work, this gives you the opportunity to make, package, and place the formal stability product. So ideally, this is about 9 months before launch, if you have that much time. It allows you to set a tentative expiry date with a combination of pilot stability, accelerated stability, and if available, similar product data. It also allows you to negotiate that quality agreement going forward. As mentioned, formal stability is what you'll be producing with your supplier. If expiration dating is used, recall that you're required to have it based on valid data, and that is your formal stability program. Most retailers will not accept any product anymore unless it has an expiry date going forward. As mentioned, conduct it as early as possible with your commercial supply chain. 9 months in advance is great because it gives you 6 months at ambient and accelerated, a couple months to look at the results and or analyze the results and adjust your conclusions. This will result in a tentative expiration date that can be established, and you can use a variety of sources for that data, your pilot stability, accelerated stability, similar product data, but recognize you're going to need to supersede that tentative expiration date with formal stability. So again, based on that valid data that's required above, and it does not absolve you of your claims responsibility. So even if you set a tentative expiry and you're wrong based on your formal stability data, you'll need to deal with that. Recall, you'll need to manage the stability program with an SOP under a written protocol and a written report. So quality agreement, I mentioned that before. What is this thing called a quality agreement? It is not a regulatory requirement that you have a quality agreement, but it really defines what is expected by each party. The FDA has been clear that having a supplier customer relationship does not absolve either party of their responsibility for quality, and it ultimately holds both parties accountable. So the confusion here is who does what, and this is a great opportunity to put a quality agreement in place between you and your supplier. So what is a quality agreement? It's a written document that establishes the obligations and the responsibilities of the QA units between each party. It defines what you will do on quality, which company does it, when do they do it, and how do they do it. For example, if there's a regulatory audit, who tells who about it and on what timing? Some recommendations about this. It's not a requirement. The FDA does not require it, but it's highly recommended. It is not a commercial supply agreement. So don't put the dollars and cents of your agreement in this quality agreement. But what I have found is you can reference your quality agreement in your supply agreement. So you can mention it and say that it has the same force as the supply agreement. I recommend that you have an SOP that defines what is in your quality agreements. Perhaps your customer does or your supplier does, and that will allow you to do this. What I have found is getting into the nuts and bolts of who does what, where, when, why is a great value in building that relationship between the parties, and it helps clarify a lot of accountability and build you a stronger base going forward with your either customer or supplier. Some of the things that you should consider in your quality agreement: recall notification and authority. Who does the recall? Who tells who about it? Regulatory notification. If you have an audit, who tells who? Who has the authority to change control on formulations, on process? What do you do about deviations and out of spec issues? Who notifies who about it? Who can modify the MMR or the master batch record? Who reviews the batch record? Who has release authority? Will you permit reprocessing and under what conditions? What about a verification program? Who's accountable for it? What will you do when that verification hits a stumble? Who will be accountable for stability? Who will retain samples? And who gets to have access to that? How often can you audit, and how much notice do you need to give for an audit? And is there ability to subcontract out some of the work here? Do you permit that authority to your supplier? So this is just a small touch on some of the things that could be built into your supply quality agreement. Again, the value is in having the discussion going forward. So with all this, you've developed your formulation, your package, you've got your stability data, you've got your process, you've got your batch record, your specifications, your methods, you've negotiated a supply agreement, and a quality agreement. You can move into launch and celebrate all the great success you've had in developing the product. So if you've done this right and you've done it thoroughly, it should lead to success going forward, and congratulations all around. Yet the technical support will continue. It's often not understood by some of our business management that there is a requirement for continued support of your product in there. So make sure your business management knows this, that resourcing is necessary as you get into the post-launch phase. Some of those things include label claim updates based on stability data. You're going to get ongoing stability data. You need to understand whether you need to change your label. There may be regulations as well that cause changes to your label. You have to monitor your complaints and AEs. You will have investigations and CAPAs that need to be managed. You'll need to manage the verification program that I spoke about. You'll have audits, and that will trigger action plans, both internal and external. You've got your stability program that will need to be managed. You'll be upgrading MMRs, either for cost or for improvements. You'll have cost savings that you'll be seeking to put into your product. And finally, you'll need to be monitoring your external regulatory environment. All of these things will be occurring, and many of these are driven by the regulations. So there's something you can't choose to avoid. You really need to plan and resource for this type of work. So to summarize, compliance and commercial success is truly possible if you plan and schedule the work, if you have the mastery built in to do thorough development work and have people with technical experience, if you have a knowledge of the regulatory environment and you stay current with that. If you put all of these together in a structured, phased approach to development, I believe and have seen that you can achieve both compliance and commercial success. So thank you very much. I think we now have time for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. That was really informative. We do have a number of questions that have come in. Our first question is, where is the list of vitamins, minerals, and herbs that were marketed before 10/15/94?
I don't know that there's an existing list. I can dig into that question and possibly provide a response, but I've never heard of an existing list. I think you need to provide evidence that and do your own research to confirm that that material was marketed before 1994.
Thank you. We have a person who's interested in a little bit more information on BAM, including what the acronym stands for.
Boy, it is it's a microbiological, is it the Bureau? Boy, I'm trying to remember. It's a microbiology forum that exists. I'll have to look it up and get back to people.
Okay, next question. How do you determine a specification range for ingredients with low stability but no safety limits, particularly the upper limit?
I would be, for upper specifications, I would be as broad as you can, provided that you don't provide any safety risk going forward. Your lower limits are typically driven by your stability requirements. For upper, you can look at what the variability is of your process, but go out a couple sigmas, 3 or 4 sigmas going forward on your upper limits for your specifications. You need to be much tighter and better controlled on your lower side. You might even consider not having an upper limit if mathematically you cannot achieve anything that's going to be a safety consideration going forward.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple people who wrote in that BAM is Bacteriological Analytical Manual.
Thank you for saving me, my friends.
Next question. What are your thoughts on best measurements of probiotics and how to assess stability to meet 100% of the label requirements?
So, yeah, probiotics are an interesting one. I just remind people it's actually not listed as a dietary ingredient. So it's kind of in regulatory la-la land. I don't know if the FDA has resolved that. So the question was, how do you best do the stability? My experience is it's typically driven most by water activity. And so you typically would want to put in on stability a variety of water activities going forward. It isn't, as you do the work, you can look at different temperatures to see if Arrhenius applies. Arrhenius relationship is the relationship that says it doubles every 10 degrees C, the rate doubles. That is not always true for probiotic stability. So you often have to do it experimentally. I wish I could give you a better answer than that, but watch out is that Arrhenius doesn't always apply, so you typically have to rely on experimental data. You're also talking about log stability as well for most of these probiotics.
Okay, thank you. Next question, how do you coordinate the design and qualification activities when you're working with a contract manufacturer? Some manufacturers say the type of information you mention is proprietary.
That's a great discussion for a quality agreement. You can do that by deciding how you want to approach that contract manufacturer. If they want to keep it proprietary, then I would set up that arrangement that you pay them to meet the specs. In other words, they can keep it confidential. They won't provide you the information. You will have to have some amount of information to meet regulatory requirements, but you pay them to deliver the specifications. If someone's more open, you can enter into a toll manufacturer arrangement, which means you tell them what to do, they perform the work, and you pay them for the service of providing the work, regardless of whether it meets specification or not. I do think you need, for those that are unwilling to do this, you need to have a heart-to-heart with them about what I mentioned about the FDA holding all parties accountable for quality. So there may be elements that they choose to hold proprietary, but if it touches on something that really gets to your quality control points, that gets on your ability to deliver specifications, that gets on your ability to defend yourself to the FDA, you're going to have a heart-to-heart with them about being open. One thing that I've also found is that you can enter into a single-party CDA, where one member of your QA organization has information that party will share, but it's limited to that one QA person. So that's another way to handle it. Therefore, it won't be broadcast within your company, but is held between that single person and your supplier.
Thank you. Do you have any recommendations for determining multiple formulation options for early stability tests?
Multiple formulation options. Well, a pretty broad question. I probably wouldn't go as far afield as too many forms, because that will be a lot of development work that you'll need to be doing to be looking at gummies and hard shell capsules and tablets. Because recall, as you're putting up those products on stability, you're going to be having to do the process development and formulation development. So you probably want to narrow it down to 1 or 2 forms as you go into that. Within that, you probably want to understand what is the risk of your stability and what your technical risks are, and make sure you've put in the appropriate controls or levers that might mitigate that. For example, if you're concerned about hydrolysis instability, one of your legs on stability may be a highly desiccated product or very low moisture. But understand what your risks are and put some different formulations up that will represent levers or ability to control that risk.
All right, our next question is: a formal stability required if expiration dates are not printed on a product?
My understanding is that is the requirement of an expiration date. It's written by that. I'm just not familiar with retailers that will buy products without an expiration date. You probably will be challenged by both regulatory authorities, but my understanding is it's driven by the need to have an expiry date.
Right, that appears to be the end of our questions. So Steve, I want to thank you so much for today's webinar. We did record it, and it will be going up on the EAS website within the next few days. Just to alert you to a few webinars that are on the horizon, we have our next in our 5-part series on OTC monographs. The next one is on February 27th. The topic is OTC labeling and drug listings. Coming on March 27th, a new one that we just added, which is what does the Farm Bill mean for the cannabis industry? And finally, on April 16th, we have a webinar that discusses dietary supplements and FSMA compliance. So we invite you to join us for any or all of those. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And we'll see you at a webinar again soon. Thank you so much, and thank you, Steve.
Thank you.